Hell's Angel biker fed, a freezing black stranger during Christmas Eve. He did not expect her to be. A feared biker with a violent past finds a freezing black woman collapsed in the snow on Christmas Eve. He gives her food. Warmth. One small act of mercy. But when she opens her eyes, she calls him by a childhood name only his dead mother ever used. She says she knew him before the bloodshed, before the gangs, when he was just a broken boy in foster care who still believed in God. Now she's back, for a reason, because his enemies are closing in, and this second chance at redemption may cost her life. Can a man built for violence choose faith before Christmas becomes a funeral? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The wind howled like a wounded animal as Anthony Knuckles Kane guided his Harley through the thickening snowfall. Christmas lights blinked half-heartedly from behind the plywood sheets covering empty storefront windows, their cheerful colors doing nothing to lift the heaviness in his chest. The temperature had dropped fast after sunset, turning the wet snow into sheets of ice that made the road treacherous. His leather-gloved hands gripped the handlebars tighter, trying to steady the bike against the gusting wind. The confrontation from earlier played over and over in his mind like a scratched record. The sound of fists hitting flesh, angry shouts, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. It was just another day's work for a Hell's Angels enforcer, but something felt different this time. Empty. The memory of his mother's face floated unwanted into his thoughts. She would have hated what he'd become. 25 years gone this Christmas, and still her disappointment haunted him. The foster homes that followed her death had taught him that only the strong survived. That kindness was weakness. The angels had given him a family of sorts, but at what cost? Block after block of shuttered buildings slid past his headlight beam. The old church soup kitchen loomed ahead, its windows dark and uninviting. Anthony was about to gun the engine and push through when something caught his eye. A dark shape huddled against the church steps, partially buried in the mounting snow. He circled the block once, warring with himself. The club had strict rules about getting involved in civilian problems, but something made him circle back again, slower this time. The shape resolved itself into a woman's form, crumpled and still. "Ah, hell," he muttered, bringing the bike to a stop. The engine's rumble echoed off the empty buildings as he dismounted, boots crunching in the fresh powder. As he drew closer, he saw she was a black woman, maybe in her 30s, wearing only a thin jacket and regular shoes, nowhere near enough protection against the bitter cold. He crouched beside her. She was breathing, but barely, her lips taking. On a bluish tinge, the snow around her had started to cover her like a blanket. Another 10 minutes, and she might not have made it. Anthony's hands hovered uncertainly over her shoulder. The smart thing would be to call an ambulance and leave. The club wouldn't approve of him getting mixed up in something like this, but the nearest hospital was across town, and in this weather. "This is stupid," he growled to himself, but he was already gathering her up in his arms. She felt light, fragile, like a bird with frozen wings. Her skin was ice cold against his neck as he carried her to the bike. Getting her positioned was awkward. She was completely limp, unable to hold on. He ended up cradling her against his chest with one arm while steering with the other, taking the corners slow and steady. His clubhouse apartment wasn't far, but the ride seemed to take forever through the worsening storm. The 3-story brick building that housed the Angels local chapter was dark except for a few windows. Anthony parked in back, away from prying eyes, and carried the woman up the fire escape to his second-floor apartment. He didn't want to deal with questions from any brothers who might be hanging around the main entrance. His apartment was cold and sparse, just a bed, some mismatched furniture, and a kitchenette. But it was shelter. He laid her gently on the worn couch and cranked up the ancient radiator before wrapping her in every blanket he owned. While she slowly warmed, he heated up a can of chicken soup on the hot plate, the only food he had that seemed appropriate for someone in her condition. The familiar scent brought back memories of his mother making soup when he was sick as a kid. In a bottom drawer, wrapped in tissue paper, was her old quilt, the only thing of hers he'd managed to hold on to through the foster homes. He never used it, but something made him get it out now. As night settled fully over the city, Anthony sat in his battered armchair watching the woman stir. He'd managed to get some soup into her earlier, and color was finally returning to her face. The quilt rose and fell with her breathing, its faded flowers still bright against the darkness of his apartment. He didn't know what he was going to do with her once she woke up properly. The club would give him hell if they found out he'd brought a stranger, especially a black woman, into the clubhouse. But watching her sleep, wrapped in his mother's quilt, Anthony couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. For the first time in years, he felt something crack in the wall of numbness he'd built around himself. Something that felt dangerously like compassion. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the city until all he could hear was the gentle whisper of her breathing and the soft ticking of his radiator in the gathering dark. The storm outside had grown fiercer as the night deepened, rattling the windows of Anthony's sparse apartment with increasing fury. He sat in his weathered armchair, watching the woman's chest rise and fall beneath his mother's quilt. The old radiator clicked and hissed, pushing back against the winter chill that seeped through the building's tired bones. Hours had passed since he'd brought her in from the snow. The soup bowl sat empty on the coffee table, a reminder of his uncharacteristic act of mercy. Anthony's fingers drummed restlessly against the chair's worn arm as his mind cycled through all the ways this could go wrong. The club had strict rules about outsiders, and he'd broken several of them tonight. A soft moan from the couch drew his attention. The woman stirred, her fingers clutching at the quilt as consciousness slowly returned. Anthony tensed, ready for anything, screaming, panic, maybe even violence. He'd seen enough people wake up in strange places to know how badly it could go. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and unfocused at first. She blinked several times, taking in her surroundings with surprising calmness. When her gaze finally settled on him, something changed in her expression, a flash of recognition that made Anthony's stomach knot. "Anthony," she whispered, her voice rough but clear. Then, impossibly, she added, "Starboy." The words hit him like a physical blow. Anthony surged to his feet, sending the chair scraping back against the floor. That name, he hadn't heard it in 25 years. Not since his mother. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, stalking back and forth across the small room. His hands clenched and unclenched, violence thrumming through his veins like electricity. "How do you know that name?" The woman pushed herself up slightly, wincing with the effort. "My name is Sophia Walker," she said, maintaining a steady gaze despite his obvious agitation. "I volunteered at St. Matthew's Home for Children back in 1998. You were there for 6 months after your mother passed." Anthony stopped pacing, struck by another wave of memories he'd worked hard to bury. St. Matthew's, his first foster placement. He'd been 12, angry, terrified, though he'd never shown it. "You're lying," he growled, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "You're too young to have been there?" Sophia's lips curved in a gentle smile. "I was 16, a church youth group volunteer. You used to hide behind the big oak tree in the yard during recreation time, reading those astronomy books from the library. Your mother called you Starboy because you could name all the constellations." The details were too specific, too accurate. Anthony felt the room tilt slightly as long-suppressed memories surfaced. He remembered a kind teenage girl who would sit with him sometimes, never pushing him to talk, just sharing her sandwich and listening if he felt like naming the stars. "You drew maps of the night sky," Sophia continued softly, "in blue crayon on printer paper. You said that's where your mom was now, up with the stars." "Stop it," Anthony snapped, but his voice cracked. He strode to the window, bracing his hands against the sill, trying to steady himself. Behind him, Sophia's words continued to pierce the careful walls he'd built around his past. "You were so gentle then, Anthony, so hurt, but still so full of wonder about the universe. I never forgot." Her words dissolved into a harsh coughing fit that seemed to rack her entire body. Anthony turned, watching her struggle for breath. His first instinct was to throw her out. She knew too much, was stirring up things better left buried. But as her coughing continued, he found himself moving to the kitchenette instead, filling a glass with water. "Here," he said gruffly, holding it out to her. Sophia took it with trembling hands, sipping slowly until the spasm passed. "Thank you," she whispered, settling back against the cushions. Her face was pale with exhaustion. Anthony stood over her, conflict evident in every line of his body. Finally he spoke, his voice low and controlled. "You can stay until morning. Then you're gone, and whatever you think you know about me, whatever you remember, you forget it. Understand?" Sophia nodded, though something in her eyes suggested she had no intention of forgetting anything. Anthony retrieved his chair, positioning it where he could watch both her and the door. Outside, the storm continued to howl, matching the turmoil in his mind, as memories he'd thought safely buried continued to surface like ghosts in the darkness. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time in a room heavy with unspoken words and resurrected history. Anthony sat rigid in his chair, eyes fixed on the woman who had somehow reached across 25 years to touch a part of himself he'd thought long dead. Every survival instinct he'd developed warned him this was dangerous, that knowing too much about someone's past gave them power over your present. But as the night grew deeper and Sophia's breathing evened out into sleep, he found himself remembering the feel of library books in his hands and the infinite promise of stars scattered across paper in careful, childish lines. Dawn crept through the grimy windows of Anthony's apartment, painting the snow-laden world outside in shades of pale pink and gray. The fierce storm had mellowed overnight into gentle flurries that drifted past like falling feathers. Inside, the small space held the heavy silence of too many unspoken words. Sophia stirred on the couch, pulling Anthony's mother's quilt closer around her shoulders as she blinked away sleep. Despite her exhaustion, she moved with deliberate care as she pushed herself to sitting. Anthony watched from his chair, where he'd kept vigil through the night, his body tense with wariness. "Mind if I make some coffee?" Sophia asked, her voice still rough from yesterday's exposure to the cold. Anthony gestured wordlessly toward the kitchenette. He observed as she found her way around the sparse space, noting how she checked each cup for cleanliness before selecting two, how she measured the grounds with careful precision. Her movements were unhurried, purposeful, like someone used to making every action count. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the room with its familiar aroma. Sophia leaned against the counter, waiting for it to brew, and met Anthony's guarded stare. "You want to know why I'm here?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Start with what happened after St. Matthew's," Anthony replied, his voice gravelly from lack of sleep. Sophia nodded, pouring 2 cups of coffee once it was ready. She handed one to Anthony, who accepted it without taking his eyes off her. I kept volunteering through high school, she began, settling back onto the couch. The more kids I worked with, the more I understood how trauma shapes us, how pain can either break us or forge us into something stronger. She paused, blowing across her coffee. I went to college for psychology, specialized in trauma counseling. Now I work with violent offenders, trying to help them find their way back to themselves. Anthony's jaw tightened. And you thought you'd add me to your list of success stories? No, Sophia answered simply. I never stopped thinking about you, Anthony. That boy who could name every star, who believed God had something special planned for him. I've been looking for you for years. Why? The word came out harsh, defensive. Because I saw something in you then, something that survived despite everything life threw at you, a light that couldn't be extinguished, no matter how hard the darkness tried. Anthony stood abruptly, pacing the narrow confines of the room. You're trying to manipulate me, using memories to get inside my head. Sophia watched him move, her expression remaining calm and steady. I'm telling you the truth. I've worked with enough manipulative people to know better than to try those tactics. They don't lead to real change. She took another sip of coffee before continuing. I counsel men who've done terrible things, Anthony. Men who've hurt people, who've lived by violence. But I've learned that violence is usually just armor covering deep wounds. And underneath that armor, there's almost always a child who once dreamed of better things. Anthony stopped at the window, his back to her. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the world in white silence. The memory of stars drawn in blue crayon flashed through his mind, unbidden. That boy is dead, he said flatly. No, Sophia replied. He's standing right in front of me, wearing a leather vest and tattoos instead of a too-big foster care sweater, but his eyes haven't changed. A distant wail of sirens cut through the morning quiet, making Anthony's shoulders tense. The sound grew louder, then faded as emergency vehicles passed nearby, but it served as a sharp reminder of the dangerous world beyond these walls. Sophia set down her empty coffee cup. I'm reopening the soup kitchen today. Anthony turned sharply. What? The abandoned church kitchen where you found me. I've been working with the diocese to restore it. Today's the first day, Christmas Day. You're out of your mind, Anthony said, disbelief coloring his voice. That neighborhood's a war zone. You'll get yourself killed. People need help, especially today, Sophia responded, her tone firm but gentle. And I believe that's why God made sure you found me in that storm. Everything happens for a reason, Anthony. The sirens had faded completely now, but their echo seemed to linger in Anthony's mind. He knew the streets, knew the rival gangs that claimed territory there, knew how quickly violence could erupt. Sophia's presence at that soup kitchen would draw attention, the wrong kind of attention, the kind that ended with blood on snow. His hands clenched involuntarily as the implications sank in. Sophia's quiet determination, her seeming ignorance of the real dangers, and worst of all, the connection to his past she represented. It was all a threat to the careful barriers he'd built between his present life and any hint of vulnerability. You need to leave, he said, his voice hard. Now, get in your car and drive far away from here. Sophia stood, smoothing the quilt before folding it carefully. I don't have a car anymore, and I'm not leaving. Those people need hope, Anthony. They need to know someone cares enough to show up, especially today. The morning light caught her face as she spoke, illuminating the same gentle strength he remembered from 25 years ago. It was a strength that made his carefully constructed walls feel suddenly fragile, and that terrified him more than any violence ever had. You don't understand what you're walking into, he warned, frustration edging his voice. The gangs around here. I understand perfectly, Sophia interrupted quietly. I've worked in dangerous places before. But fear can't be allowed to win, or hope dies. And without hope, we're all lost. Anthony stared at her, seeing the immovable resolve behind her calm exterior. The same resolve that had kept her searching for him all these years. The same quiet certainty that had once made an angry, grieving boy believe in stars and purpose and possibility. The snow continued to fall outside, adding another layer of white to the world. But Anthony could already see the footprints that would mar its perfect surface, the shadows that would gather as day progressed, the invisible lines of territory and power that crisscrossed these streets like tripwires. And now Sophia, this echo from his past, this unwanted reminder of who he'd once been, was about to walk right into the middle of it all. The realization settled over him like a weight, heavy with implications and consequences he couldn't yet fully grasp. But one thing was crystal clear. Her presence here, her determination to reopen that soup kitchen, was about to complicate everything. And in his world, complications got people killed. The late morning sun struggled to pierce through heavy clouds as Anthony watched Sophia bundle up in his spare jacket. It hung loose on her small frame, making her look even more vulnerable. Every protective instinct told him this was a mistake, but her quiet determination left him no choice but to help. "You can lean on me," he said gruffly, offering his arm as they stepped into the snow. Sophia accepted his support without comment, though he could feel her slight trembles from lingering weakness. The walk to the church kitchen was slow and careful. Anthony found himself automatically scanning rooftops and alleyways, hyper-aware of every shadow. The streets were eerily quiet, most people staying inside on Christmas Day. Their footprints marked the fresh snow in parallel lines, his heavy boots, her smaller steps. The abandoned church kitchen looked even more desolate in daylight. Paint peeled from its wooden siding, and icicles hung like teeth from the eaves. Sophia produced a key from her pocket, her hand steady despite the cold as she unlocked the heavy door. Inside, their breath fogged in the frigid air. The space was clean but bare. Industrial steel counters, old cooking equipment, stackable chairs pushed against walls. Sophia immediately moved to check the pipes, while Anthony got the ancient heating system running. "The water should flow once the pipes thaw," Sophia explained, her voice echoing in the empty space. "There are space heaters in that closet. We'll need all of them." For the next hour, they worked in companionable silence. Anthony found himself falling into an unfamiliar rhythm, following Sophia's quiet directions, carrying boxes of donated food from a back storage room, helping her set up serving stations. The physical work felt good, purposeful in a way he hadn't experienced in years. "The diocese dropped off supplies yesterday," Sophia said, unpacking canned goods and dried pasta. "I was checking everything when the storm hit." She paused, looking at him. "God works in mysterious ways, doesn't he?" Anthony didn't answer, busying himself with getting the industrial stove working. But her words settled uncomfortably in his chest, stirring memories he'd long buried. The first guests arrived just after noon, an elderly couple supporting each other carefully across the icy sidewalk. Sophia welcomed them warmly, while Anthony hung back, expecting fear or hostility. Instead, the old man nodded at him with simple dignity. More people trickled in as the afternoon progressed. A mother with 3 small children. Several men wearing worn military jackets, their postures still parade ground straight despite their circumstances. A teenage boy who couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Sophia knew many by name, greeting each one as if they were guests in her home. Anthony found himself serving soup, the steam rising between him and the people he helped. Their quiet thank yous felt foreign to his ears. When was the last time anyone had thanked him for anything? His hands, so accustomed to dealing hurt, now passed out bread and filled coffee cups. "You're good at this," Sophia said softly as she passed behind him with more bowls. "They trust you." "They shouldn't," he muttered, but his heart wasn't in it. The warmth in the room wasn't just from the space heaters. It came from the murmur of conversations, the small smiles, the simple human dignity of sharing food with strangers on Christmas Day. A flash of movement caught his eye through the window. Anthony tensed, recognizing the distinctive shape of motorcycles moving slowly past the building. Not his club's bikes. These were different, belonging to a rival gang that had been pushing for territory lately. "Sophia," he said quietly, drawing her aside. "Those bikes outside. This isn't just about the soup kitchen, is it?" She met his gaze steadily. "No," she admitted. "I know the FBI has been investigating the Angels. There are rumors you might cooperate with them." She touched his arm gently. "Other gangs see you here, helping instead of hurting. They'll think those rumors are true." Anthony's jaw tightened. "You knew this could happen? You knew helping you would put a target on my back?" "I knew you needed a reason to choose a different path," Sophia replied, "even if that choice comes with consequences." The afternoon light was already fading as Anthony stepped outside, positioning himself where he could watch both approaches to the building. Inside, he could hear Sophia's voice mixing with others, could smell the soup and coffee, could feel the pull of that simple human warmth. But out here was his reality, the weight of his gun under his jacket, the knowledge of violence waiting to erupt, the impossible choice between loyalty to his club and something deeper he couldn't yet name. More motorcycles cruised past, their engines purposefully loud. They were counting exits, noting weaknesses, sending messages only Anthony could read. He stood his guard as darkness gathered, snow beginning to fall again. Behind him, the light from the soup kitchen windows spilled onto the white ground like hope. Before him stretched the familiar shadows of his violent world. And for the first time in decades, Anthony Knuckles Kane found himself caught between the two, knowing that protecting Sophia and this fragile space of grace might cost him everything he'd built his life around. The snow continued to fall, covering his boots, each flake a question he couldn't answer. Could a man's soul be worth saving if he had to lose everything else to save it? The last guest departed just as evening settled fully over the city, leaving behind empty soup pots and grateful words. Anthony watched through the window as the elderly veterans made their way carefully down the salted steps, their breath visible in the cold air. The rival bikes had maintained their distance all afternoon, but their presence hung like a shadow over the peaceful Christmas gathering. Sophia moved quietly through the kitchen, wrapping leftover bread and storing containers. Her earlier weakness seemed to have faded, though Anthony noticed she still leaned occasionally against counters for support. The snow had started falling again, thick flakes dancing in the glow of the streetlights. "We should head back," Anthony said, scanning the darkening street. "Storm's picking up." Sophia nodded, pulling on her coat, a proper one this time, retrieved from the church office. They locked up in silence, and Anthony kept close to her as they walked through the deepening snow. His apartment wasn't far, but every shadow seemed to hold potential threats. The usual Christmas lights that decorated the neighborhood felt too bright, too exposing. Inside his apartment, the warmth enveloped them immediately. Sophia settled onto the worn couch, tucking her mother's quilt around her legs while Anthony made coffee. The familiar routine felt strange now, domestic in a way his life hadn't been for decades. "Thank you," Sophia said as he handed her a mug. "Not just for the coffee, for everything today. Those people needed that meal, that kindness." Anthony dropped heavily into the chair across from her. "Kindness," he repeated, the word bitter in his mouth. "That's not exactly what I'm known for." "No," Sophia agreed quietly. You're known for violence, for being the enforcer, the one they send when messages need to be delivered. But that's not all you are, Anthony. He stood abruptly, pacing the small space. You don't know what I am, what I've done. I work with violent men every day, Sophia said, her voice steady. Men who've hurt people, destroyed lives, carried guilt so heavy they think they'll drown in it. That's my job, helping them see that trauma doesn't have to define them forever. Anthony stopped at the window, watching the snow. Some things can't be fixed. No, Sophia agreed. We can't undo the past, but we can choose differently moving forward. She paused, sipping her coffee. Want to know what I see when I look at you? He didn't answer, but she continued anyway. I see that same boy who used to read to the younger kids in foster care, who once spent 3 hours looking for a lost kitten in the rain, who believed, deep down, that God had a purpose for his life. That boy died a long time ago, Anthony said roughly, along with everything else good in my life. Is that what you really believe? Or is that what you tell yourself because it's easier than admitting you have a choice? Anthony turned to face her, anger flaring. Choice? You think I have a choice? Everyone I've ever cared about ends up destroyed. My mother, my foster sister, partners who trusted me. His voice cracked. Violence isn't just what I do. It's what I am. Everything I touch turns to blood. Sophia set her coffee down and stood, approaching him slowly. That's the lie, Anthony. That's the trauma talking. Violence isn't your nature. It's what you learned to survive. But you're not that scared foster kid anymore. No, he agreed bitterly. I'm much worse now. Are you? Sophia challenged gently. The man I saw today fed people who were hungry, protected those who needed shelter, chose to help instead of hurt. For one day, Anthony said. One day doesn't erase years of... He broke off, running a hand over his face. No, Sophia said, but one day can be the start of something new, if you let it. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft tick of snow against the windows. Anthony's shoulders were tight with tension, his hands clenched at his sides. I should go, Sophia finally said. I can leave town first thing tomorrow morning. Give you space to figure things out without complications. She gathered her coat, moving toward the door. You don't owe me anything, Anthony. You saved my life yesterday. That's more than enough. Anthony stared at the door, at Sophia's hand resting on the handle. The words stuck in his throat. The easy agreement, the dismissal that would let him return to his familiar darkness. But he couldn't force them out. Sophia waited, patient and still, while the snow fell outside and the clock ticked away seconds that felt like years. The choice hung in the air between them, as heavy as a gun, as fragile as hope. Anthony stood frozen, unable to say the words that would send her away, unable to ask her to stay. The door remained closed, Sophia's hand still on the handle, while the night deepened around them and redemption waited silently for an answer. The December morning crept in gray and cold, seeping through the thin walls of Anthony's apartment. He hadn't slept much, tossing and turning on his cramped couch while Sophia took the bed. His mind kept circling back to their conversation, to choices and changes and possibilities he'd stopped believing in years ago. The clock read 6:15 when he finally gave up on rest. He could hear Sophia moving quietly in the kitchen, the soft clink of cups and plates floating through the still air. The familiar scent of coffee drew him from the couch, his joints stiff from the uncomfortable night. Morning, Sophia said softly, pushing a steaming mug across the counter. She looked tired but determined, already dressed in yesterday's clothes with her coat draped over a kitchen chair. I thought I'd head out early before the roads get too busy. Anthony wrapped his hands around the warm mug, not meeting her eyes. You don't have to rush off. We both know it's probably safer if I do. She smiled, but there was sadness in it. Thank you for everything, Anthony. These past 2 days, they've meant more than you know. Before he could respond, urgent pounding at the door made them both jump. Anthony moved instantly between Sophia and the entrance, his body tensing for trouble. But when he yanked the door open, he found Mrs. Chen from the soup kitchen, her thin face creased with worry. "Thank goodness you're here," she gasped. "It's Tommy, the veteran who comes for meals. Some men caught him sleeping in the church doorway. They're hurting him bad." Sophia was already grabbing her coat. "We need to call the police." "No time," Anthony growled, reaching for his jacket. "Which direction?" "Anthony, wait!" Sophia caught his arm. "Don't do anything you'll regret." He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then met her eyes. "Trust me." The three of them hurried through the bitter morning air towards the church. Even from half a block away, they could hear the commotion. Cruel laughter, the thud of boots, a pained groan. Anthony's hands curled into fists as they rounded the corner. 4 men surrounded a crumpled figure in the church doorway. Tommy, who Anthony recognized from yesterday's Christmas meal, was trying to protect his head as kicks landed against his ribs. The veteran's thin jacket offered little protection from the assault. "Hey!" Anthony's voice cut through the morning like a gunshot. The attackers turned, sneering at first, until they recognized him. Their faces went pale. "Shit, it's Knuckles Kane," one of them muttered, backing away. Anthony advanced slowly, his reputation doing half the work for him. Every muscle in his body screamed for violence, for the familiar release of letting his fists do what they did best. But Sophia's presence at his back made him hesitate. "Walk away now," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "and we pretend this never happened." 3 of them immediately scrambled backward, but the 4th, young, stupid, probably high, pulled a knife. "You don't own these streets anymore, old man. Word is you've gone soft." Everything slowed down. Anthony saw Sophia's hand reaching for her phone, saw Mrs. Chen kneeling beside Tommy, saw the knife trembling in the punk's unsteady grip, and for the first time in years he saw a choice. The knife wielder lunged forward. Anthony moved with the fluid grace of long practice, but instead of striking to hurt, he redirected the attack. The knife clattered away as he locked the younger man's arm behind his back, controlling without crushing. "I said," Anthony repeated calmly, "walk away." He released his hold and stepped back. The would-be attacker stumbled, then ran after his friends, leaving only the echo of pounding footsteps in the empty street. Sophia was already calling an ambulance while Mrs. Chen pressed a clean handkerchief to Tommy's bloodied face. Anthony stood guard until sirens wailed in the distance, his body humming with unused adrenaline. "You okay?" he asked Tommy gruffly. The veteran managed a weak nod. "Thanks, man. Thought I was done for." After the paramedics loaded Tommy into the ambulance, after Mrs. Chen headed home to make soup for later, Sophia and Anthony walked slowly back toward his apartment. The morning sun was finally breaking through the clouds, painting the snow-covered streets in pale gold. "You surprised them," Sophia said quietly. "The ones who attacked Tommy. They expected violence." "So did I," Anthony admitted. "It's usually my first answer. My only answer." They stopped at the corner, where their paths would diverge. Sophia turned to face him, her eyes bright with something that looked like pride. "I've worked with hundreds of men trying to change their lives," she said, "but I've never been more certain of anyone's capacity for transformation than I am of yours right now." Anthony shifted uncomfortably under her steady gaze. "It was one time, one choice." "Yes, Sophia agreed. "And it proves what I've known since you were that kind boy in foster care. Violence isn't your nature. It's just been your shelter for so long you forgot there were other options." Hope flickered in Anthony's chest, unfamiliar and fragile as a candle flame. He started to respond, but movement across the street caught his attention. A flash of something in an upstairs window, gone too quick to identify. The weight of unseen observation prickled across his skin. The neon sign of the Crossroads bar buzzed and flickered against the darkening winter sky. Anthony sat alone at the counter, nursing a ginger ale and trying to process the day's events. The restraint he'd shown that morning felt foreign, like wearing someone else's clothes. He rubbed his temples, remembering Sophia's proud smile. The door swung open, letting in a blast of cold air and 4 familiar figures. Anthony's muscles tensed before his mind even registered why. Viper, Snake Eyes, and 2 prospects from the Red Devils MC. Their presence here wasn't a coincidence. "Well, well." Viper's raspy voice carried across the nearly empty bar. "If it ain't the famous Knuckles Kane, heard some interesting stories about you lately." Anthony kept his eyes forward, counting heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. The bikers spread out, surrounding him. 4, 5, 6. "Funny thing is," Snake Eyes added, leaning against the bar, "word has it you've gone religious, playing guardian angel to some black social worker." He spat the words like poison. "My business is my business," Anthony said quietly, still not looking at them. Viper laughed, but there was no humor in it. "See, that's where you're wrong, brother. When a Hell's Angel starts acting funny right when the feds are sniffing around, that becomes everybody's business." The bartender had disappeared into the back room. Smart man. Anthony carefully set his glass down, noting positions, distances, angles. The old violence stirred in his blood, familiar as breathing. "That woman," Snake Eyes continued, "the one you've been protecting? Be a shame if something happened to her. Accidents happen all the time in this neighborhood." Anthony's vision went red. His hand tightened on the glass until his knuckles went white. "Don't," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Or what?" Viper moved closer. "You gonna call the cops on us? Maybe testify?" Anthony's elbow caught him in the solar plexus before he could finish the word. The fight exploded in a blur of fists and broken furniture. Anthony fought with cold precision, but he was outnumbered. A bottle shattered against his shoulder. A boot caught his ribs. He managed to put Snake Eyes through a table before a knife sliced his arm. Breaking free, Anthony crashed through the back door into the alley. His motorcycle roared to life as shots rang out, bullets pinging off dumpsters. He gunned the engine, tires throwing slush as he escaped into the maze of side streets. Blood dripped down his arm as he pulled up to his apartment building 20 minutes later. He'd taken a circuitous route, making sure he wasn't followed. Sophia was waiting in his kitchen, and her face went pale when she saw him. "Oh my God," she breathed, already reaching for the first aid kit she'd brought with her supplies. "What happened?" "You need to leave," Anthony said, wincing as she helped him out of his jacket. "Tonight. Now." Sophia's hands were gentle but firm as she cleaned his wounds. "Tell me what happened first." "Red Devils," he grunted. "They think I'm working with the feds. They threatened you directly." "I'm not leaving," Sophia said calmly, pressing a bandage to his arm. Anthony grabbed her wrist, forcing her to look at him. "This isn't a game, Sophia. These men will kill you to get to me. They'll—" "No." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm not running, Anthony. Fear has ruled your life long enough. It's ruled this whole neighborhood long enough." "Damn it, woman!" He stood up, ignoring the pain in his ribs. "This isn't about fear. It's about—" An orange glow through the window caught his attention. Sophia turned to look, and they both froze. Flames lit up the night sky a few blocks away, right where the church stood. "No," Sophia whispered. Then she was running for the door, Anthony close behind her. They could hear sirens before they rounded the last corner. The old church was engulfed, flames reaching toward heaven like desperate prayers. Firefighters battled the blaze while neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, some crying, others just staring in shock. Mrs. Chen clutched her rosary, tears streaming down her face. Tommy, released from the hospital earlier, sat in his wheelchair with fists clenched in helpless rage. "All our supplies," Sophia said numbly. "The food, the blankets, everything we—" Anthony watched the flames consume the building where, just that morning, he'd chosen mercy over violence for the first time in decades. The message couldn't have been clearer. This was war, and it had just claimed its first casualty. Firefighters shouted instructions over the roar of their hoses. Water turned to steam in the winter air, creating a hellish fog that danced in the firelight. Anthony pulled Sophia close as she began to shake, whether from cold or shock or grief. He couldn't tell. The church's ancient wooden beams groaned and crackled. With a sound like thunder, the roof collapsed inward, sending a fountain of sparks into the night sky. Each ember that fell was another meal that wouldn't be served, another person who wouldn't find shelter, another small kindness burned away by hatred. Anthony felt something shift inside him as he watched their work go up in flames. The war had begun, but this time, he knew exactly which side he was on. Dawn crept over the city like a bruise, painting the smoke-stained sky in shades of purple and gray. The church's ruins still smoldered, steam rising where snow met hot ash. Anthony had worked through the night, helping neighbors salvage what they could, and finding places for those who needed shelter. Mrs. Chen's apartment above her corner store became an impromptu command center. Her tiny living room was packed with displaced people, blankets spread across every surface. The old woman moved between them like a quiet guardian, offering tea and comfort in equal measure. "You should rest, Anthony," Sophia said softly, touching his arm. She looked exhausted but determined, her clothes still smelling of smoke. "You haven't stopped moving since the fire started." "Can't rest," he muttered, checking his phone again. He'd been making calls all night, calling in favors from people who owed him, finding beds and couches for the displaced. "Tommy needs his medication. The pharmacy doesn't open until 8 o'clock. "I'll go," Sophia offered. "I have my car, and you're dead on your feet." Anthony shook his head. "Not safe. I'll take him myself once it opens." But Sophia was already pulling on her coat. "These people need you here. I'll be fine. It's broad daylight, and the pharmacy's only 4 blocks away." Before Anthony could protest further, his phone rang. Unknown number. He stepped into Mrs. Chen's kitchen to answer it, keeping his voice low. "Yeah? Looking for your girl?" The voice was familiar. Snake Eyes, second in command of the Red Devils. "Better hurry, she's getting cold." Anthony's blood turned to ice. "What are you talking about?" "Check your messages." The phone buzzed. The photo showed Sophia, unconscious, tied to a chair in what looked like an abandoned warehouse. Snow dusted her hair. This was recent. "Touch her and you're dead," Anthony growled. "Warehouse district, building 13. Come alone, or we start sending her back in pieces." The line went dead. Anthony burst back into the living room, but Sophia was already gone. Mrs. Chen looked up from where she was serving tea. "She left 5 minutes ago, said not to wake you." Anthony ran down the stairs and into the street. Sophia's car was gone. Fresh tire tracks in the snow led east, not toward the pharmacy, but toward the warehouse district. They'd grabbed her en route, made it look like her choice to drive there. His motorcycle roared to life, the sound echoing off buildings still sleeping in the pre-dawn light. The warehouse district was 15 minutes away, a maze of abandoned buildings and broken dreams. He knew it was a trap, knew they'd be waiting. Didn't matter. Building 13 loomed ahead, its broken windows like dead eyes. Anthony killed the engine and dismounted, every sense screaming danger. Too quiet, no guards visible. They wanted him inside. The main door creaked open at his touch. Darkness waited within, broken by thin shafts of light from high windows. The space smelled of rust and rot and something else, something copper-bright and familiar. "Sophia?" His voice echoed in the emptiness. A spotlight blazed to life, blinding him. In that moment of vulnerability, they struck. Bodies emerged from the shadows, fists and boots finding their marks with practiced precision. Anthony fought back, but they'd planned well. 6 against 1, maybe more. A pipe caught him across the back of the knees. He went down hard. Through swelling eyes, he saw Sophia still tied to the chair, watching in horror as they systematically broke him. Snake eyes emerged from the shadows, brass knuckles gleaming. "Should have stayed in your lane, brother," he said, almost sadly. "Should have remembered what you are." The beating continued until Anthony could barely move. Through waves of pain, he heard Sophia screaming, begging them to stop. Snake Eyes knelt beside him, pulling out a knife. "Choose her," he said, carving each word into Anthony's chest, "or choose us." They left him there, bleeding into the snow. Sophia's screams faded as they dragged her away. Anthony tried to rise, fell, tried again. The warehouse spun around him, a carousel of pain and failure. Each breath was agony, but he forced himself to move. The journey back to his apartment was a nightmare of semi-consciousness. He crawled when he couldn't walk, fought to stay awake when blackness threatened to take him. Dawn had fully broken by the time he reached his door, leaving a trail of blood across pristine snow. Inside, he collapsed onto the floor. The apartment felt vast and empty, a tomb of his own making. On his chest, the carved warning burned like brands. "Choose her, or choose us." But they'd already chosen for him. Everyone who got close to him ended up destroyed. His mother, and now Sophia. Blood dripped onto the hardwood floor, each drop an accusation. He'd done this. His presence in her life had doomed her, just as he'd feared. The morning light crept across the room, illuminating the space where Sophia had slept, where she'd made coffee and talked about redemption. Now there was only silence, and the knowledge that his attempt at change had cost an innocent woman her life. The morning light crept across Anthony's apartment floor, painting streaks through dust motes and dried blood. His body felt like one massive bruise, each breath sending shards of pain through his chest, where Snake Eyes' message remained carved into his skin. The silence pressed in around him, broken only by the soft ticking of an old clock, a sound that brought him back to childhood memories he'd long buried. He remembered sitting in St. Mary's Chapel with his mother, her warm hand holding his small one, as they prayed together. She'd always said God had special plans for her, star boy. Back then, he'd believed her. But that was before she died, before the foster homes, before he learned that survival meant becoming the thing others feared. Anthony dragged himself to his knees, ignoring the protest of torn muscles and cracked ribs. His eyes fell on the corner where Sophia had slept, where she'd looked at him with such certainty that he could be more than his violence. Now she was gone, taken, because he'd been too afraid to fully choose a side. "God," he whispered, his voice rough. The word felt foreign on his tongue. "I know I got no right. After everything." He stopped, anger suddenly surging through him. Where were you? When Mom died? When I was getting beaten in those homes? When I became... He gestured at his blood-stained clothes, his scarred knuckles. Sunlight caught the edge of his mother's old quilt, the one he'd wrapped Sophia in that first night. Something inside him broke. I'm sorry, he choked out. I'm so damn sorry, for everything. For thinking violence was the answer, for believing I couldn't change. Tears mixed with blood on his face. Help me find her. Please. Not for me. I don't deserve it, but she believes in something better. Like Mom did. The prayer poured out of him, raw and unpolished. No formal words, no proper phrases, just the desperate plea of a man who'd finally reached the end of his own strength. As he spoke, memories flooded back. His mother teaching him to pray before bed, reading him Bible stories about people who found new paths, singing hymns as she cooked Sunday breakfast. "Star boy," she'd said once, "sometimes God's biggest miracles look like surrender first." Anthony stayed on his knees as the morning light strengthened, remembering every person he'd hurt, every life he'd damaged in the name of loyalty to a code that only brought destruction. Sophia had been right. Fear had ruled his life. Fear of weakness, fear of change, fear of hope itself. He thought about the soup kitchen, about the grateful faces of people who'd seen past his reputation, about Sophia's quiet certainty that redemption was possible for anyone, about his mother's unwavering faith that her son was meant for more than violence. Slowly, painfully, Anthony pulled himself to his feet. His reflection in the window showed a man he barely recognized, battered, vulnerable, stripped of all pretense. The carved warning on his chest had stopped bleeding, but the choice it demanded still burned. Her or us? For the first time in 20 years, the answer was crystal clear. Anthony limped to his closet and pulled out an old shoebox. Inside lay his colors, the vest that marked him as a member of the Hells Angels. He'd earned every patch with blood and loyalty. The vest represented power, brotherhood, protection, everything he'd thought he needed to survive. Now it felt like chains. He took out his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized years ago, the FBI task, force dedicated to motorcycle gang activity. He'd been given this number once before, told he could use it if he ever wanted out. Back then, he'd laughed at the idea. "Special Agent Wilson," a voice answered. "This is Anthony Kane." His voice was steady despite the pain. "I'm ready to talk, about everything. The Red Devils, the Angels, all of it." There was a pause. "You understand what this means?" "Yeah, I do." Anthony looked at his mother's quilt again. "But first, they've taken someone. Sophia Walker. I need your help finding her." "Where are you?" "My apartment, but I'm coming in. Just give me an hour to do something first." After hanging up, Anthony carefully cleaned his wounds and changed his clothes. Each movement was agony, but he forced himself to move deliberately, methodically. This wasn't about rushing into another fight. This was about ending the cycle. He picked up his colors one last time, feeling the weight of years of violence in the leather. Then he folded the vest carefully, placed it in a box, and wrote an address on top. The club president's home. No note needed. They'd understand. The sun was fully up now, turning the snow-covered streets into rivers of light. Anthony's bike waited below, frost glinting on its chrome. He'd ridden this machine into countless battles, always choosing the path of violence. Now he would ride it one last time, not to fight, but to surrender everything he'd thought defined him. His mother's words echoed in his mind as he mounted the bike. "Sometimes God's biggest miracles look like surrender first." The engine roared to life, but this time it wasn't a battle cry. It was a farewell to the man he'd been, and maybe, Just maybe, a beginning of something new. The rising sun painted the city gold as Anthony Kane rode toward surrender, toward hope, toward the hardest kind of courage, the courage to change. The federal building loomed ahead, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Anthony parked his motorcycle in plain view of the security cameras, making no attempt to hide. His body ached with every movement as he climbed off the bike, but his mind was clearer than it had been in years. Inside, the lobby felt unnaturally warm after the winter cold. Security guards tensed at his appearance. They knew exactly who he was. "I'm here to see Agent Mark Rivera," Anthony said quietly, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. Within minutes, Rivera appeared, flanked by 2 other agents. The federal agent's face remained neutral, professional, but his eyes showed a glimmer of respect for what Anthony was doing. "Let's talk somewhere private," Rivera said, leading Anthony to an interview room. For the next 3 hours, Anthony laid out everything he knew. Names, dates, locations, 2 decades of criminal activity spilled out onto recorded tape. He drew maps of warehouses, listed corrupt officials, and detailed the entire trafficking operation the Red Devils had built. His voice grew hoarse, but he kept talking, knowing every detail might help find Sophia. "The old cannery on Mason Street," Anthony said, pointing to a spot on the map. "That's their main holding facility. If they've got Sophia anywhere, that's where she'll be." Rivera studied the location. "You understand that by giving us this information, you're accepting full responsibility for your own crimes as well?" Anthony nodded. "I know. Just find her first." The raid was organized within the hour. Anthony watched from the federal building as tactical teams mobilized, their vehicles moving out in silent precision. He'd given them everything they needed: guard rotations, security codes, blind spots in the surveillance. Now all he could do was wait. The minutes crawled by like hours. Rivera kept him updated through short radio bursts. "Teams in position. Entering now, first floor clear." Then finally, "We've found her. She's alive." Anthony's legs nearly gave out. He steadied himself against the wall, breathing deeply. "They're bringing her out now," Rivera continued. "She needs medical attention, but she's conscious and stable." They let Anthony watch from a window as the ambulance arrived at the nearby hospital. Even from a distance, he could see Sophia was badly beaten, but she was moving, alive. As paramedics carefully transferred her from the tactical medical team to the emergency staff, she suddenly looked up, straight at the federal building window where Anthony stood. She couldn't possibly see him through the reflective glass, but somehow she knew. She raised her hand slightly, a small gesture of acknowledgement, before they wheeled her inside. "Time to go," Rivera said quietly behind him. Anthony turned, holding out his wrists. The handcuffs clicked shut with a finality that should have felt threatening, but instead brought a strange sense of peace. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't running, wasn't fighting, wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't. "You did good today," Rivera said as they walked toward the detention center. "A lot of lives will be saved because of this." Anthony nodded, thinking of Sophia's raised hand, of his mother's faith, of the long road ahead. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors as officers led him through the security doors. He'd chosen surrender over destruction, truth over loyalty to lies. And somehow, in losing everything, he'd found something he thought he'd lost forever: peace. The cell door closed behind him with a heavy clang. But Anthony Kane, for the first time in decades, felt truly free. January brought bitter winds to the prison yard, but Anthony barely noticed the cold anymore. 3 months into his sentence, he'd settled into a routine that felt almost like penance. The concrete walls and steel bars that had initially felt suffocating now provided a strange kind of sanctuary. He declined protective custody despite his status as a former gang member who had turned evidence. I'll face what comes, he told the warden simply. The consequences arrived swiftly. A shiv in the shower, brass knuckles in the yard. But Anthony didn't fight back, didn't run. He took the hits, went to the infirmary, and returned to his cell. By April, word spread through the prison that Kane wasn't what they expected. The violence against him slowly ebbed. One morning in May, he noticed a young veteran named Marcus struggling to control his temper during breakfast. Anthony recognized the signs, the shaking hands, the hollow eyes, the hair-trigger rage. He sat with Marcus that day, and the next, just listening. "I can't stop seeing it," Marcus confessed one afternoon. "The things I did over there, the things I keep doing in here." "Violence lies to us," Anthony replied quietly. "Makes us think it's all we are." He shared what Sophia had taught him about trauma, about redemption being a choice made daily. Soon other inmates began joining their conversations. By summer, Anthony was leading informal group sessions in the yard, teaching breathing exercises Sophia had described in her letters, sharing her insights about breaking cycles of violence. Sophia's letters arrived like clockwork every 2 weeks, each one filled with updates about her recovery. "Physical therapy is brutal," she wrote in June, "but every step reminds me that healing takes time." She described the rebuilding of the church kitchen, now expanded into a full trauma recovery center. "Your story inspires people here," she told him. "They see hope in second chances." Anthony kept every letter, rereading them during long nights when doubt crept in. He wrote back about his struggles and small victories, about rediscovering his mother's faith, about learning to believe in grace. By September, he was officially recognized as a peer counselor within the prison system. The warden asked him to help develop a program specifically for veterans dealing with violence and trauma. "You have a gift for this," the warden observed. "You speak their language." October brought news that Sophia had completed her physical therapy. "Still some scars," she wrote, "but they remind me why this work matters." Her trauma recovery program was gaining recognition, drawing participants from across the state. She never mentioned the pain she'd endured because of him, focusing instead on hope and healing. November's winds carried early snow, reminding Anthony of that fateful Christmas Eve when he'd found Sophia in the storm. His release date was set for January 15th, just weeks away. The knowledge filled him with equal parts anticipation and uncertainty. "Winter's returning," he wrote to Sophia in early December, "but this time, I'm not afraid of the cold." Her response arrived just before Christmas. "Sometimes the hardest storms bring the most important changes. You taught me that." In his cell on Christmas Eve, Anthony held her latest letter and watched snow fall beyond the prison fence. 1 year had changed everything. He had lost his freedom, his identity as an enforcer, his connection to the only family he'd known for decades. Yet somehow, in that losing, he had found himself again. The winter wind howled outside, but inside, Anthony felt warm with purpose. Whether or not Sophia would be part of his future, he knew his path now. Violence had been his prison long before these walls. True freedom would come in helping others break those same chains. He carefully folded Sophia's letter and added it to the stack he kept. Through the small window, he could see fresh snow coating the prison yard in white. January 15th drew closer with each passing day. Whatever waited beyond those gates, Anthony Kane was finally ready to face it. Not with fists, but with faith. Snow drifted down in lazy spirals, coating the rebuilt church steps in pristine white. The December air held that special kind of stillness unique to Christmas Eve, broken only by muffled footsteps and quiet greetings as people made their way toward the warmly lit entrance. The soup kitchen's transformation was remarkable. Fresh paint brightened the walls, and new windows sparkled with strings of white lights. Where boarded-up despair had once dominated, hope now radiated from every corner. A hand-carved wooden sign above the door read, "Community Kitchen and Healing Center," in elegant letters. Anthony Kane stood across the street, watching people file inside. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he gathered his courage. He looked different now, clear-eyed and steady, his old leather jacket replaced by a warm wool coat. The hardness in his face had softened, though traces of his past remained etched in the careful way he surveyed his surroundings. Through the windows, he could see Sophia moving among the tables, greeting guests with genuine warmth. Her dark hair was shorter now, and when she turned, the scars on her neck were visible, permanent reminders of that terrible night a year ago. But they didn't diminish her. If anything, they seemed to amplify the quiet strength that radiated from her. Taking a deep breath, Anthony crossed the street and climbed the steps. The door chimes tinkled as he entered, bringing with him a swirl of snowflakes and winter air. Several faces turned to look, some curious, some knowing. A few of the veterans nodded in recognition, having heard his story through the recovery program. Sophia looked up from where she was arranging bread baskets. For a moment, they simply gazed at each other across the room, a year's worth of letters and changes hanging in the air between them. Then she smiled, that same gentle smile that had first pierced his defenses in his dark apartment 12 months ago. "Welcome home," she said softly, approaching him. Up close, he could see the exhaustion around her eyes, the weight of all she carried, but her spirit seemed undiminished. "The place looks amazing," Anthony replied, his voice rough with emotion as he took in the transformed space. Where there had once been bare walls, local artists had painted murals of hope and healing. Photos lined one wall, faces of community members, volunteers, success stories from the trauma recovery program. They worked side by side serving food, falling into an easy rhythm. Anthony noticed how Sophia had arranged everything to be accessible for elderly visitors, how she knew everyone's names and stories. She had built more than just a soup kitchen here. She had created a sanctuary. Mrs. Martinez, an elderly woman who lived down the block, watched them work together with knowing eyes. As Anthony refilled her coffee cup, she touched his arm gently. "Tell me, young man," she said in her softly accented English, "who is Sophia to you? I see how you look at her." Anthony paused, considering. The old him would have deflected, hidden behind walls of carefully constructed toughness. But that man was gone, transformed by grace and hard-earned wisdom. He watched Sophia across the room as she laughed with a group of veterans, her scars catching the candlelight. "She remembered who I was before I forgot," he answered softly, the truth of it settling deep in his chest. "When everyone else saw what I'd become, she saw who I could be again." Mrs. Martinez patted his hand, her eyes twinkling. "Ah, that is a special kind of love, mihijo." The evening flowed on, filled with the kind of gentle joy that can only come after great pain has been survived. Children from the neighborhood performed Christmas carols. Veterans shared stories of recovery. Former inmates spoke of finding purpose through the center's programs. As night deepened and snow continued to fall outside, someone dimmed the overhead lights, leaving the space illuminated by candles and Christmas lights. The warm glow caught the condensation on the windows, creating halos that matched the peace settling over the gathered community. Laughter rippled through the room as people shared memories and hopes. Anthony found himself joining in, his deep chuckle mixing with Sophia's bright laugh. The sound surprised him, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it felt so natural now, so right. Looking around the room, he saw his own journey reflected in dozens of faces, people who had known darkness but chosen light, who had fallen but risen again. Sophia had built this place of healing, but she hadn't done it alone. Every person here had contributed to its spirit of redemption and hope. The conversations quieted as someone began playing Silent Night on an old piano in the corner. Sophia appeared at Anthony's side, her shoulder barely touching his as they listened. In the candlelight, surrounded by this unlikely family, Anthony felt the last pieces of his old self fall away. This was what his mother had always tried to tell him about faith. Not that it made life perfect, but that it made life whole again, even with all its scars and broken places. He had finally learned what she meant, though the lesson had come at great cost. The snow fell steadily outside, covering the city in fresh white possibility, while inside, candles flickered and hope burned steady and strong. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.